Bruno Racine is the president of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you. We're happy to be here.
I'd like to start off with your definition of a national library, whether or not it's more than just collecting all that's published and making it available, or if it serves a greater role than that.
Well, the first mission is clearly to collect whatever has been published in a country. And we have a long tradition of this in France because the legal deposit was instituted in the 16th century. So
a lot of material.
A lot of material, indeed, and of practice as well. But there is a broader sense, broader mission, which is universal. And not all the national libraries think that it's their mission to have such an ambitious goal. But with several others, we have for generations acquired, collected documents or books related to other cultures, so that it's a gateway to world cultures also.
Much like the Library of Congress.
Much like the Library of Congress, yes.
Yeah.
Or the British Library and a few others.
So you see your role as capturing everything that's been produced in the French world?
Also in the French or Francophone world, but the French kings used to buy Islamic manuscripts, Chinese one as early as the 17th century. So having items representative of those cultures is also, in our mind, essential.
And why is that?
Well, because culture is not, of course, nations have their own culture, but a more demanding concept of culture is almost by definition universal, open to others.
And you can see that just simply in the way cultures or a country's population evolves.
This is all the clear now that the French population is changing, at least in the big cities, quite quickly.
You want to reflect what's going on in those different
France
cultures.
has been a country of immigration in the 19th and 20th century. European immigration, Poles, Italians, Spaniards, Portuguese, etc. And now North Africa, Asia also. We have to take into account this new reality.
Yes, it used to be an imperial country, now it's almost the reverse of that.
The reverse.
Speaking of French culture and appealing to a broader audience, I'd like to get into, it's called Europeana?
Europeana, yes.
This is sort of a digitization, European digitization of cultural artifacts.
Absolutely.
That was just launched and crashed because it was so successful. At least that's the spin that's been put on it.
I think it will reopen for Christmas.
Oh, is that right?
Yes,
okay.
Before Christmas.
Okay. And you played an important role in that with the Gallica, is it?
Yes, Gallica is the digital library of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and it was the first launch by a national library ever. It was 11 years ago. Mm-hmm. It started at a moderate pace.
Now this is scanning primarily.
And now it's scanning, yes. And now we have shifted to a more ambitious program, which in numbers can be compared to what Google is doing with other libraries. At the beginning, it was rather an anthology. We were digitizing 5,000 or 6,000 books a year. Now we are digitizing 100,000.
So much more comprehensive.
Much more comprehensive, yes. Although we have millions of books, so it would be, in any case, a small portion or a minority, let's say.
Which brings up the fascinating challenge of choosing. What?
Yes. But at the beginning, the choice was, so to speak, a positive choice. When you make an anthology, you choose the better. But
who says what is better?
The librarians, of course, that's their job. But now it's different, because when you reach such numbers as several hundreds of thousands, the selection process tends to be based on negative criteria. So you don't digitize what is in bad condition, what is under copyright, or in foreign languages, because we digitize as a matter of priority French books in French, of course. So it's in an industrial process now we're experiencing now.
I want to bring up, this is very recent, that the library in Lyon chose to go with Google.
Yes.
And I've read that they did that in part because your scanning program was too slow.
No, because I think it was a bad interpretation of what the director, with whom we have very good relation, said. Actually, our scanning process is quicker than the one in Lyon, the current one. But that's not the problem. Lyon, the city of Lyon, made a decision for financial reasons because they couldn't afford the digitization of 500,000 books. We know the price. It's very
$100 million or
yes,
thereabouts.
it's very expensive. So
They would have to pay that to you to have the scanning done, or
who Lyon?
yeah,
No, Lyon. Google scans for Lyon
understood.
for free, and
But they would have saved if they'd had to go through the Gallica process. They would have had to pay.
No. Either the state would have provided the money, but I don't think it was a priority, or the city or private sponsors.
Yes,
anyway.
okay.
They would have
Just to pay
to
for
raise the money
Yeah,
for them. So it's a big saving for them. Of course, the consequence is that Google has an exclusivity, relative exclusivity on the digitized material for quite a long period of time. But in the long run, everything will become available through different channels. I understand the choice. For me, it's not really an issue that they chose Google, as long as we can maintain our own programs. The difference between Google and our program or the other European program is not so much in the content, because Google is currently digitizing huge and famous libraries, Harvard, Stanford, part of Oxford. But it's not a digital library. A digital library is something different than digitized material. You have to figure out new architectures. That's the job of librarians, and Google has no librarians. The digitized books, huge quantities of books, which are going to become available to the whole world, but they don't try to put in place new tools to take advantage of this huge quantity of material. So,
for example, what?
Well, if for one request you have 1,000 answers, what is the hierarchy? What are the reliable sources, etc., etc.
Yeah.
That's an intellectual added value, which is the essential contribution of a library.
A librarian helps you access the right information.
The right information to make the correct assessments, etc., etc. So that's the direction in which we are going to work.
So your emphasis would be on the scanning, of course, that has to be done.
Has to be
but
done.
But then the tools to help the general public, let's say.
Yes, because if it's an anthology, if it's a limited number of books which are digitized, it doesn't matter. But when you have hundreds of thousands or millions of references, you need assistance.
Surely Google would argue with you.
I don't think not on this point, but because their strategy, as far as I understand it, which is rational, is to have as many books as possible
under their domain.
In the public domain in 10 or 15 years, and after that, perhaps they will consider another phase.
And they have the right then, obviously, to sell advertising around it, which is how they make their money. Yes. Whereas yours, there's no advertising around it?
There's no advertising.
No, okay.
Although we are being audited by the French Inspection des Finances, and perhaps they will advise us to recommend
hiring a sales force.
But for the time being, we don't.
Okay. I'm speaking with Bruno Racine, who's the president of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. I'd like to get your reflections on and thoughts on the amalgamation of the archives and the library in Canada.
Yes, I visited my Canadian counterpart, Jan Wilson, very efficient and brilliant head of the Library and Archive of Canada. I think it makes sense to have the two domains, books and archives, under the same roof, especially if you consider the future. Many of the challenges are common. Preservation issues, digitization, preservation of digital data, which is a crucial issue. People are not aware of this, but or not enough aware of this. But at home, you know that your digital data can vanish very quickly, and they are much more perishable than books, for instance. So since many editorial content now is digital born, doesn't exist on paper, how can we preserve it for the future generation? This is a big issue which is shared by archives and libraries as well. So I think it makes sense, and since in Canada those institutions, the previous institutions, were not so deeply rooted in history, it could be managed. In France, I can't see this happen because we like archives and the national former kings or royal library have existed for centuries. They're very huge institutions, and although.
But it makes sense, though. That's the thing. Logically, it seems to me, as an outsider, it makes sense to. First of all, there's the acquiring of the archival or whatever it might have to be. Then there's cataloging. There's finding, identifying, and then telling, talking about and identifying what it is and its context. And then there's accessing.
Conceptually, it's not so different. Although a national library is supposed to collect everything which has been published, while an archive must from the outset make a choice. This is a theoretical distinction, because in practice even these differences now narrowing. But it's a matter of history, of size. We have different buildings which are either 17th century buildings or more recent ones. To merge the two
cultures too.
Two networks, two big networks. I don't think we would save.
Because they're two empires that there's no way they deign to work together.
On the other hand, we must work together on several issues. For instance, digital repositories. That's something we could do together.
It's funny though. It makes sense, common sense, to do this. Were you saying that there's reluctance because if the head of the archives in France agreed with you, then it would happen?
Yes, but what would happen in practice? There would be a single president above, and then two vice presidents with different locations, different staff, and perhaps some function like finance or budget could be merged. In practice, it wouldn't change a lot.
It would be more efficient, though, wouldn't it? You think?
I'm not sure, because we have also some element in common with museums, for instance. In the library, we have, of course, books, but not only books. We have map, prints, works of art, also paintings, etc., etc. And in those areas, our problems are more like those of museums than of archives. Yeah.
So it's going to take a few years then.
Well, I think the National Library will remain a separate institution for a long time. Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to, in closing, just talk about you. You're a novelist.
I'm also a novelist, yes.
And in fact, what was it, the governors of
Morée? Governor de Morée. Morée is the former name of what is called Peloponnesus in the ancient times and in modern times again.
How old were you when you wrote it?
I was 29, I think.
And it won Best First Fiction or Best First Novel
Best
award?
First Novel of the year 82, so not of all time. So,
yeah.
and limited to France as well.
Okay.
So
still pretty good.
So it was not so bad. It was unexpected.
And what was it that?
It was I tried to imagine the diary of a Venetian governor in Greece, who at the beginning of the 18th century builds a fortress, a very impressive fortress which actually exists. And when the fortress is completed, Venice decides to hand it over to the Turks. And the governor who is building this fortress suspects that there's something wrong, but is not sure.
He's being undermined then?
Yes.
By the people at head office.
How he overcomes this frustration by transforming the old family palace in Venice into something sumptuous. So,
And I assume there's a love interest.
not in the sense of love story.
It's more his love of what he's doing.
Yes, love is doing, yes.
Why do you think it won the award?
Well, I don't know, because it was at that time there was a moment in France where, although it's based on history, but it's not based on actual research, it's really a fiction. There was an interest again in historical fiction in France at the time.
And you just happened to...
As a metaphor of what was taking place in the real world, in the contemporary world. But after that I wrote another historical novel, and the other ones are all in the contemporary world.
You stopped there. You became a very successful public servant. That's odd.
Well,
is it odd?
It's... I don't know if it's odd, it's not too frequent, but...
it's pragmatic?
It's not exceptional. We have some very well-known French writers like Giraudoux, Claudel, and others were top civil servants. Others like Mallarmé were teachers. Saint John Perse, the Nobel Prize for literature, was also a top diplomat. Okay. Chateaubriand. It's more frequent. I served in diplomacy also.
Yes.
It's more frequent in this category than in others.
More frequent in France, then?
In France, yes.
Yes. You know, it's quite almost contrary.
Oh.
The world view of a writer versus the world view of a civil servant. But interesting. Finally, then, you've also written about, now is it How to Live in Tuscany? Rome
the
as
English,
well.
those two books have been translated into English, not my novel.
Not your
living,
novel.
Living in Rome and Living in Tuscany.
Yes.
When I was director of the French Academy in Rome, Villa Medici, I wrote two books on Rome and Tuscany, and we made those books with a very good artist, photographer, who was also a novelist, by the way, Alain Fléchère. So it was a very... we loved to do those books. I wrote the text, I chose the places, etc., etc.
Yeah.
It's not only about landscape or works of art, but also going into some people's houses, restaurants, etc., etc.
So very much a sort of a social...
It's like social, and it's also a practical guide to a certain extent.
And that takes us to Stendhal.
Which is one of my passions. As a diplomat also, not a very successful one,
No.
but
and a lover, and perhaps not such a successful lover either.
No, because he was a very shy and awkward man.
Pined after women.
But because of this frustration, he wrote very much.
He channeled it into
literature.
Does that describe yourself?
Oh, I've been more lucky in my private life, and I have a very family which I love very much. And
you have 4 children, right?
Yes, and in my career, the highest assignment that he ever had was Consul de France at Civitavecchia, the harbor of Rome, which was a very not a very appealing city. But I'm afraid he's a far greater writer than I shall ever be.
Well, you're making your impact felt during your own lifetime, and he still is with us. Well, having written, though, this is your form of immortality. Will you write something else?
Yes, of course. Although my present job is quite a demanding one. It's the largest cultural institution in France. And I've undertaken a new novel. But really, I'm at the very beginning. I'm not able to write a book a novel in 6 months. It takes 2 or 3 years. That's why. So I'm not 60, so I can add some others.
Wonderful. Well, we've got that to look forward to, and also the new digital
library.
So thank you very much for sharing.
No,
your
it was
thoughts
my
with
pleasure.
us, and best of luck in the future.
Thank you very much.